Good morning, my name is Duncan Campbell and today I will be giving a brief overview for the day 2 of the European meeting of the International Society of Medical Publication Professionals. So before we begin, just a few very brief disclosures. I'm a Director of Scientific Communications at Aspire Scientific Limited. I'm also one of the team members that helps to run the publicationplan.com, who presented a meeting summary for the ISMPP meeting. And we also presented a poster at the ISMPP EU meeting, although I won't be discussing that in this particular session, just so you know. So without further ado, this is the agenda for the second day of the ISMPP EU meeting. Over the course of the next few minutes, I'll plan to run through each of these sessions and discuss some of the key take-home messages that were discussed. That is with the exception of the speed research session, which is shown here just faded out, as all of the content in that session was covered elsewhere in the posters. So one of the key themes for ISMPP EU meeting, and especially for the second day, was data transparency. And this was covered quite thoroughly in the first session of the day, which was a 5-speaker panel, started by Trish Groves of BMJ, who started off by discussing open science. So the theory of open science is it takes us a step beyond open access publishing, which is just relating to manuscripts, and extends that to protocols, to data, and to the peer review process. Data transparency and data sharing is something that's recently been picked up on by ICMJE and various other industry bodies who have introduced data sharing statements into their guidelines. However, we need to be cautious with this approach, as simply dumping data into online repositories isn't going to be good enough. We always need to be conscious of the context in which we do this. And Trish discussed a couple of possible routes through which this could be achieved, citing, for example, the EU Science Cloud, which will apply to forthcoming EU research as one potential solution. Closing out her presentation, Trish did mention the recent BMJ Open Consensus Statement, designed to promote discoverability and reuse of data. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to run through that in its entirety in this session, but I would encourage you to seek that out after the meeting and take a look. The next speaker in this session was Andy Powrie-Smith of EFPIA, who started his session by discussing the shifting cultural landscape around pharma-presented data, noting that there is a decrease in confidence and trust in industry's presented data, and instead the general public are preferring to seek out and analyse data on their own. Yet on the one hand, while we have this call for increased transparency and increased data availability, we also have conflicting views of people looking for increased patient privacy and data deletion. So how do we balance these two conflicting perspectives? Well, Andy took a look at the EFPIA Pharma principles, which lay out data sharing throughout the clinical trial reporting journey, and noted that most pharma companies do actually have reasonably robust policies in place to regulate and permit access to the sharing of clinical data. However, the uptake of that at the moment is relatively low. This isn't any reason for despondency though, as Andy highlighted in his discussion. There is no reverse gear for transparency. It's here now and it's here to stay. So the question is, how do we implement it effectively going forward? And that really hinges on 3 central themes: collaboration between pharma companies, confidentiality, continued confidentiality of patient data, and consistency of reporting to allow that reuse. We then took a look at data transparency from the EMA perspective with a presentation from Anne-Sophie Henry-Eude, who focused particularly on the clinical data publication policy. And her presentation looked at 1-year data following its launch in 2015. Now we saw over that period over 3,500 registered users to download data and well over 80,000 data downloads. So there's clear enthusiasm for access to this data. But that doesn't mean it's all plain sailing. The EMA, when it analysed this data, found that pharma still has a tendency to over-redact some of the data that is submitted to it. Oftentimes it's not even necessary. Some of the information is already in the public domain or is in the public interest to be included. So there's a little bit of a mindset shift still needed from pharma when it comes to data transparency. We carried on then with the pharma perspective with a presentation from Katherine Tucker of Roche, who discussed the fact that today we generally consider trial registration to be a standard and accepted part of the clinical trials process. However, disclosure of the data outputs from those trials is not currently standard, and that's frustrated by a rather fragmented ecosystem of reporting databases, looking different places for different data. It's not easy to find, and there's very little standardization between those routes of finding the data. Furthermore, from that pharma perspective, there can be internal challenges, such as retrospectively identifying information from old trials or getting back in touch with investigators who may have lost contact with. Yet, certainly from the Roche perspective, there is a commitment to the FAIR principles of making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that will hopefully take us from a position of historically rather poor data sharing into the future, where industry will be much better about sharing data, be much more transparent about it, and most importantly, build that into data sharing right from the start. So into the data plan, you already know exactly where you're going to be sharing data, and it's less of an afterthought once the data become available. Closing out this session then, rather appropriately, we had a patient presentation from Rafal Swierzewski from the European Cancer Patient Coalition, and also a cancer survivor himself. Clearly demonstrated the interest and the relevance of clinical data to patients themselves. But he highlighted, with all the various stakeholders in clinical research and all the various routes that they require to access the data and their different analytical needs, there's no real clear route for patients to access that data. And rather shockingly, oftentimes patients aren't even acknowledged within some of the clinical trial reporting that goes on. So towards the end of his presentation, he reiterated his organisation's mantra that really there should be nothing about patients without the patients. The afternoon of the meeting saw us move on to the first keynote session of ISMPP EU, which was presented by Dr. Mohammed Al-Ubadli, who is a physician and CEO of an organisation called Patient Knows Best, which is a secure online platform that allows patients access to their own health medical records. He presented how this approach really can make a lot of sense when you think that the patient is actually the only person involved in every single consultation about their particular health condition. The patient is also the only person legally able to share their own personal data with third parties, charities, other researchers who might have an interest in assisting them. While this sort of approach does take a bit of a shift in mindset, and is certainly a shift in power to what we're used to today, if executed effectively, this sort of patient access to their own digital care plan might be able to increase patient engagement and adherence with their treatment plans. The afternoon then split off into 3 parallel sessions, and attendees of the meeting could choose to visit 2 of those sessions, but you get to hear about all 3 today. The first one was a look at patient involvement in research and where the opportunities and challenges lie. This particular session looked, to begin with, at an investigation of clinical trials published in BMJ between 2015 and 2016, and found that of 52 trials, only 1 included a patient author on the authorship byline. However, that one article actually outperformed all of the others in the study in terms of tweets and altmetric attention score. So there's a clear interest and impact that can be gained from including patients in clinical research. And that can extend to pharma as well, who are now starting to look at how patients can be involved in the planning of publications and the planning of trials. But it's just finding that balance of how best to engage with patients as we move forward. One such example of this comes from BMJ, who have implemented their patient partnership strategy that involves patients and carers as a part of their editorial teams. And they're now providing input on all sorts of articles, both solicited and unsolicited. Patients are able to provide fresh new perspectives that previously have not been present in the journal. The second parallel session looked at the growing importance of real-world evidence and what it means for us as publication professionals. So there's an increasing demand for real-world evidence, particularly to mirror clinical trials and also to fill the knowledge gaps that are left after the completion of clinical trials. And today, the gathering of real-world evidence and real-world data is becoming easier and easier with biobanks, with the growth of big data and artificial intelligence. We can gather a lot of this information, and that's not escaped the notice of regulators, who are increasingly calling for the use of real-world data in regulatory submissions. So real-world evidence is important and it's here to stay, but that doesn't mean that it's without its challenges. During the presentation, we heard where some of the pitfalls are today with real-world evidence. They tend to revolve around a few key themes. First of all, real-world evidence teams are often separate to the trial teams, a little bit siloed, and they don't necessarily talk to each other as well as might be ideal. Sometimes there's uncertainty over some of the endpoints or some of the protocols that makes it difficult to plan the publications from real-world evidence. And finally, when you get through all of that, you get to the end, sometimes journal editors just aren't as interested in real-world evidence. So these are all issues that need to be overcome as real-world evidence becomes more and more popular and a more important part of the research journey. The final parallel session focused on the challenges of publishing unfavourable, negative or equivalence data, basically the unexciting data that there is still a commitment from pharma to publish, but sometimes is met with, again, that lack of interest and lack of enthusiasm, sometimes even from the investigators themselves. This can be a particular problem in niche areas such as rare diseases. We heard of a case study in rare diseases where that challenge is exacerbated by small sample sizes, by unconventional trial designs, then even more so by the limited knowledge pool in rare disease space, where you might run up against the same peer reviewers submission after submission, and you can find that you're just getting the same comments. So they started to look at a few tips about how to publish such unexciting data, and really the main tips coming out of that were honesty and communication with both the journal and the lead authors, having a plan for where you're going to publish, how you're going to publish it, and keeping that dialogue open with the journal and the publishers throughout the process. The last session of the day then, and closing out the meeting, was the second keynote of the day, delivered by Andy Powrie-Smith again, and he looked at the potential impact of Brexit for the UK healthcare scene. Now, many industries can claim to be special and need special treatment around Brexit, but when it comes to healthcare, if things grind to a halt, then obviously that puts patients' lives at risk. So it does warrant some special consideration. And he revisited 5 main themes during his talk. The first one was around regulation. So the UK currently sponsors a lot of European clinical trials. What will happen to those on day one of Brexit when we're no longer a part of the EU? The UK and the EU both respectively hold a number of marketing authorisations that will need to be transferred and into usable on day one of Brexit to ensure that medications that we currently use are still legally prescribable. We currently enjoy free trade with the EU, which allows imports and exports of medical products. What happens if free trade is not available on day one of Brexit? Will that impact the free availability of drugs, and will that potentially impact upon patient care? Similarly, free movement of people is something that we also enjoy at the moment, and we're able to employ and recruit some of the most talented researchers in the sector into the UK. Will that be possible post-Brexit? From a research standpoint, we're a large recipient of EU research funding in the UK. Obviously, we won't be post-Brexit. How will that loss of funding affect our ability to fund research and fund the best talent? Finally, intellectual property. Under EU law, intellectual property rights are protected. If that's not in place when we leave the EU, is there a risk that we will lose research funding, we will lose input into our pharma and research sectors? So really there are a lot of questions at this stage around Brexit. I don't think anybody knows the answers to these questions at the moment. I think that's something that will shake out over the course of the next year. And I have no doubt that revisiting this will be a prominent point in ISMPP EU 2019. So we can look forward to that next year. But for now, that rounds out the meeting. Just thank you very much for your attention. Point you towards the publicationplan.com for a full written report of this meeting. Thank you very much.